it open. And stir it into your wort with a sterilized spoon. As I said before, this is the most dangerous time in brewing, so avert your breath and make sure everything that touches the wort is sterilized. After you've stirred in the yeast, cover your wort quickly to prevent bacterial infection. The final step is to add water to the airlock. You add it about 1/3 full. 1/3 to a half full. Keep the fermenter in an area with a steady room temperature and away from bright lights. Ideally, your temperature should be 60 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit, but do the best you can. Remember to keep the temperature steady. Sudden variations in temperature can shock yeast, causing it to release off flavors and even stop working. Depending on the yeast strain and temperature, fermentation will start in 8 to 48 hours. We'll know fermentation has started when the airlock bubbles. If we remove the airlock and peer inside, averting our breath, we can see the head of foam that's risen on the fermentation. As you can see, that ferment is just taken off and it's a nice foamy ferment. Once the head of foam is risen, fermentation will proceed vigorously for 1 or 2 days and then subside. It's important to leave the beer in the fermenter for about 7 days after the vigorous ferment to give the yeast a chance to complete its residual fermentation and a chance to settle out before bottling. After the beer has been in the fermenter for 10 or 12 days, the airlock will have stopped bubbling. Looking at the side of the fermenter, we can see that the yeast sediment is settled and the beer above is relatively clear. Now it's time to check the beer with a hydrometer to see if a reasonable finishing gravity has been reached. Finishing gravities can vary quite a bit depending on yeast strain used, temperature, and malt used. For this batch, brewed with 6 pounds of American Light and fermented with ale yeast, I'd expect a finishing gravity of between 1.009 and 1.015. If you're in doubt as to whether your beer is finished, take a hydrometer reading now and another in 3 days. If the temperature has remained constant, 60 degrees Fahrenheit or above, and the readings are the same over 3 days, your beer is finished. To take a hydrometer reading, just fill the hydrometer vial with your finished beer. Spin the hydrometer to dislodge any bubbles that may keep it buoyant. Looks like we have a finishing gravity of about 1.010 for this batch. The last step in brewing is priming, adding 4.5 ounces of our corn sugar to the 5 gallons of fermented beer to give the yeast a little extra food to produce carbonation. Transfer the beer from the fermenter to the priming tank, using a hose to avoid splashing. Unlike before fermentation, when oxygen was beneficial to yeast growth, now we want to prevent aeration of the finished beer. Aeration can cause the yeast to ferment too vigorously, possibly causing overcarbonation. Stir the priming sugar thoroughly into the beer with a sterilized spoon. I've set up a little assembly line to make bottling as easy as possible. First, get your sterilized beer bottle and fill it to within 1 inch of its neck with the priming tank. Then cap it. Be careful when capping so as not to crush the bottle's neck. Place your finished beer in a dark place with a steady temperature of 55 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit if possible. The beer will be fully carbonated after about 6 days, but it won't reach its peak flavor for about 2.5 to 3 weeks. Remember that your beer is a living thing, full of live yeast. After reaching its peak flavor in about 3 weeks, you'll start to become drier in flavor as the yeast still in the bottle consumes the fermentable sugar still left in the beer. After about 6 weeks,